So the couple of hours I spent with little Richie, going over all the gear and stuff, and him teaching me how to do things and how to put things on, gave Dave the time to have a few coffees and to basically sober up. So he was getting the dive operations beginning at his place. When I got back a couple of hours later, Amanda was down there and she was taking phone calls and she was in the books and she was writing things down and she was just basically making sure that the divers were checked in. So when I got back to Dave's, Dave was out the back on his porch, and he had a few chairs on it. I think he had 6 chairs, and 6 people were sitting there. There were 6 people in Dave's living room, and they were doing exams. So they were basically doing the open water exams that I had done the day before. And Dave's come on and come sit down. So Dave had his whiteboard out and his dive tables, and he handed me a little plastic slate which was dive tables which had depth and times on it, and this is how we understood how the depth that you go to the amount of minutes that you could spend underwater. You had from 10 to 100 feet, which was the deepest recreationally that you could go on compressed air, and it wasn't done many times because you only had a maximum of 10 minutes and a safety stop, a 3-minute safety stop. So they were basically bounce dives. I was to learn all the stuff as we went along. So Dave would show us, 70 feet and then go along, and it would come up and it would give you 30 minutes. You would do your deepest dive first, and then you would shallowly go up, and then you would get a little bit more time, 60 feet for 40 minutes or 55 feet for 40, all this type of stuff. So this was something I sat with the class and started learning. Dave had a mask, a set of goggles, as people call them. So he had a dive mask, he had a snorkel, he had a regulator, and on the regulator there was 2 regulators. There was your primary and your secondary. Okay, your primary you would use, your secondary you would hook up onto your BCD, and then you would have a depth gauge, and then you would have an air gauge. And your air gauge, basically, as soon as you turned the tank on, a little needle would shoot round and it would tell you the amount of air that was in your tank, and that would be in pounds. So or bar basically. So it would basically tell you how much air was in your tank and how long you had underwater. You had a depth gauge that also basically ran from feet, from 0 to it ran to 130, but I very rarely went to 130 feet because then nitrogen narcosis would kick in, which is when the air basically turns poisonous and makes you drunk. You get a feeling of being drunk. So this was something else I learned on the day as well. So you had 4 attachments on it, and then you had a little valve at the top that you flattened out. You put it onto your dive tank, you set it into it, a little rubber seal would be there, it would go against the seal on the tank. You would turn it in, you would tighten it, you would make sure that it was hand tightened. You would pick up your air gauge and you would turn it away from you, or you would put it down. You wouldn't look directly at it because once you turn the air on, if there was a crack in that, it could crack and go in your face. So I always got mine and I wrapped it inside a towel. This is something else I learned to do. And then I would turn that gauge upside down, very slowly turn the air on, and then check, give it a few seconds, and then I would check the depth. Also your air pressure gauge and your depth gauge. So that's what would happen with that. So these are the skills that we went over. The BCD, or the buoyancy control device, was basically a jacket that you put on and you just snapped together, or you zipped up, and you could inflate it via your air tank. On that, it also had it wasn't a regulator, but it was a tube with a mouthpiece on the end, that if you had air in your BCD and it was inflated and you ran out of air in your tank, you could breathe from your jacket. So it was very clever and it was brilliant. It also had on the dive regulator, it had a hose that you hooked in to this mouthpiece, and it allowed the air to be inflated from the tank into the jacket as well. So it was very good kit, very good skills. Again, I'd never seen any of this stuff. I'd seen the earlier versions on Jacques Cousteau. The stuff that Dave had was decor, as far as I know. Really good kit, very expensive. And so we went through all this stuff. Dave showed us lead weights and belts and how to feed the lead onto the belts, how to weight ourselves. But we didn't know how much weight we took until we actually got in the water. And for me, that would be in the afternoon. That would be around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Dave again had sobered up and his head wasn't hurting. So we went through these skills. We went through the decompression of it, how to clean it in water, how to hang it, to make sure that your jackets were clean and disinfected. Another trick Dave showed me to test the air from your regulator was to get a white t-shirt or a white piece of cloth and put it over your regulator and press the regulator so the air would come through the regulator. And if it was infected or dirty air, the white material would turn grey or black, and then you knew that was carbon monoxide from the filling tanks, from one of the vents where the diesel fumes would get into it and contaminate the tank. So Dave also taught me that, because I did get a dirty tank later on, and I didn't really feel good after it. It was quite a shitty experience. So that's the stuff in the daytime that Dave taught me, and I was fucking blown away. I was absolutely blown away at how much that you needed to learn to be a basic open water scuba diver. And Dave was absolutely phenomenal, and he'd spent a lot of money on his education. I didn't really realise until later on that Dave was a diver in the military. He was a SADS diver, a strategic army diver, I think as they called him. And David had been involved in a lot of stuff, a lot of shit, and he was his education was just unreal. But he never bragged, he never boasted about anything. Oh, I can do this, I've done this, I've done that. These were things that I just found out later on in just conversations from other people who knew Dave, you know. And then I would sit down and say, Dave, oh, your friend told me this, is that true? And he'd go, yeah. And I was like, you know, just kind of blown away. He was an absolutely phenomenal guy. He was, you know, he was the grey man. You could look at Dave and you wouldn't think it was military. You wouldn't think anything about him. But Dave was very, very highly trained and very knowledgeable, and the amount of things and skills that I learned from him, I've never learned from anybody else. And I'm not saying that because Dave was my cousin or my friend or my mentor, you know, but the amount of things that he taught me was just incredible. I've never learned anything like that on other courses. Anyway, so we spent most of the morning doing the skills and going over and putting the gear on and getting our tanks together and putting the equipment together and checking everything, checking our depth gauges and our everything, our regulators, and breathing from it, and putting the mask on, and having the tank on the back on land, putting not flippers, they're called fins, flippers a dolphin, and all this type of stuff. And we learned this on land. And later, after lunch, we'd be going down to the dock where the boat was with Richie, and we'd be getting into the shallow part of the water, and we'd be doing our skills in there. So Richie came up a few minutes later. All the divers that were going diving were already down on the dock. So Richie had everything done. He went up to Dave. He picked up a small walkie-talkie, and he had a radio on the boat as well. So Richie came for the antenna. He would teach me later on how to put things up and how to operate the radio, which I'd never done before. And so he took the divers diving, and there was another young guy on the boat with Richie, a young guy called Carlos, Richie drove the boat and he took people diving, whereas Carlos sat on the boat while Richie took them diving. And then if they were away from the boat, Carlos would drive the boat over and pick them up. Usually they were just static line dives where the boat would hook up to a buoy, and Richie would take him basically in the square and come back and surface where the boat was. If it was a drift dive, which meant you got in at one point and just drifted or swam underwater to another point, Carlos would stay anchored on the buoy, and then once Richie told him which direction they were going to be and Richie surfaced, he would inflate a big orange 2-foot long inflatable balloon and would hold it up. Carlos would see that, drive the boat and pick them up, and that's how the dives went. So the first dive was usually about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and the second one then was just before lunch. an hour or two later, and then that would do it. There may be another dive in the afternoon or a night dive, depending on the amount of people and what they required.